Thank you for being so patient, everyone, and welcome back to the Naughty Archaeologist podcast. This last week has been quite eventful. I've had several events going on in my personal life, so I appreciate you being so patient with me as I get back into podcasting for you guys. This week, we're going to talk about the Spitfire, a Revolutionary War-era gunboat that was commanded by none other than America's very first trader, Benedict Arnold, whose name has become an epitaph for those who are guilty of the crime. Benedict Arnold wasn't always anti-America, though. He, in fact, was a very clever commander and had assisted in, and actually was quite instrumental, in the Continental Army's very first real victory against the British, the capture of Fort Ticonderoga. So buckle up, nerds. We're about to swim all the way back to the Revolutionary War, on the border of Canada, New York, and Vermont, in the fall of 1776, just after the signing of the Declaration of Independence. So put on your life jackets. Let's get wet, nerds.
Avast! It's complicit. The timbers were way too big. But what really tells the story are thousands of pieces. We looked at them all. The treasure was not gold or silver. It was the people.
The story of Ticonderoga is actually really fun. Fort Ticonderoga is a 5-pointed star located at the meeting of Lake Champlain and Lake George, smack in the middle of New York and Vermont, but also smack in the middle of Albany and Montreal, Canada. So not only is it interstate, it's international. Benedict and the Green Mountain Boys took Fort Ticonderoga under cover of night in a surprise attack that the British never saw coming. Bloodless, no one was killed, and the Continental Army would ultimately control Fort Ticonderoga until 1777, when a siege would see them lose it again. However, in the meantime, the Continental Army was able to take the cannons away from Fort Ticonderoga and drive the British out of Boston, using the artillery that they had pulled from the fort. Fort Ticonderoga was a major win for the Continental Army, and it was a major proving ground for good old Benedict. Benedict Arnold may have started as a pharmacist, but he was proving to be a pretty savvy commander. The following year, 1776, in the fall, on October 11th, the naval Battle of Valcour Island, also sometimes called the Battle of Valcour Bay, took place on Lake Champlain. There is absolutely an argument to be made here that this was the first naval engagement of the United States Navy. Ultimately, the battle proved to be a failure, but only in that they lost the battle. But it did have a strategic success. It delayed the British long enough for the Continental Army to refuel and reset over the winter, and it stalled the British from reaching the upper Hudson River Valley, where they were all located. It bought them time. Initially, Arnold positioned his fleet, which was small, in a line, but quickly he was overrun and swarmed by British vessels. They put up a hell of a fight, though. The British had reportedly run out of ammunition, and by dark, they had the American forces on the run, but not without taking heavy losses themselves. In order to avoid letting their ships fall into British hands, Arnold and his men burned the remaining ships that hadn't already sank. It took almost all day. And trying to avoid capture, Arnold and some of his fleet threaded their way through a gap between the British and the island, and they slipped away into the morning. It was along this escape route that Arnold burned and scuttled most of his fleet so that the British couldn't take it. And the British had them on the run for 2 full days. The boats were leaking, the winds were high. It was a really rough journey. But Arnold and the rest of the quote-unquote Navy were able to escape and make it back to Washington. Despite the British now having control of Lake Champlain, he still was able to stall them, and he gave the Continental Army the time that they needed to resupply and heal from the previous summer. During a survey of Lake Champlain in 1997, divers came across an interesting target. It turned out to be Benedict Arnold's own ship, the Spitfire. To find out more about that ship, we're going to bring in Chris Sabick of the Lake Champlain Maritime Museum out of New York. So without further ado, Chris, welcome to the Naughty Archaeologist Podcast. If you'd be so kind, go ahead and introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you do at the Lake Champlain Maritime Museum.
Sure. My name is Chris Sabick. I'm the executive director of the Lake Champlain Maritime Museum, where I've been employed for now, this is my 25th year working at the Maritime Museum. I started here as an intern and am now the executive director. So I've made my career here on Lake Champlain and really enjoyed every minute of it. So I've come up through the ranks on the archaeology side of our program here at the museum and was most recently the director of the research and archaeology at the Maritime Museum before I stepped into the executive director role just last November. So
that's very exciting. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Today, we are going to talk about the Spitfire shipwreck. Tell us a little bit about the work that you've done in the past, as well as maybe some of the upcoming work that's going to be going on with the shipwreck itself.
Sure. Well, the gunboat Spitfire was one of 8 gunboats, gondolas. They've got a variety of different names that were built on Lake Champlain in 1776 in an effort to defend Lake Champlain from the anticipated British invasion coming down from Quebec. You know, at this Lake Champlain's orientation as a 122-mile long north-south lake really provided the only easy transportation route through the wilderness of Vermont and New York at the time. You know, transporting anything on water is much more efficient than trying to fight your way through the mountains and dense woods that lined both sides of the lake. So control of that lake and that corridor, that water corridor, was really important. The southern end of Lake Champlain nearly, comes within 50 miles of touching the headwaters of the Hudson River, in which case you have a continuous water route from New York City all the way to Montreal. So controlling that corridor was immensely important, and the Americans had already used the corridor going north to invade Canada in 1775, and they expected the British to do the same thing in 1776 coming south. So after that attempted invasion of Canada failed in 1775, and they were forced to retreat back up Lake Champlain in early 1776, the Americans settled into the southern end of Lake Champlain and started building a fleet of vessels to defend the lake from the coming British invasion. And one of those vessels they built was the gunboat Spitfire. This class of 8 vessels is 54 feet long. They're all based on the same design, 54 feet long, 15 feet wide, mounted 3 carriage guns, typically a heavier gun in the bow, like a 12-pounder, and then 9-pounders off to each side, though we've found that there's been some variation in the armament just by what guns were available. The Spitfire itself was laid down on July 1st and launched just a few weeks later on July 22nd, after which it traveled up to Fort Ticonderoga, which was also still in American control at the time and was kind of the base of operations. And there it was rigged and had the cannons loaded on board, and then it joined Arnold and the rest of the fleet on August 15th in 1776. It participated in the battle at Valcour Bay on October 11th, and then in the retreat south from Valcour as the American forces attempted to escape from they were kind of pinned behind Valcour Island and the New York shore on October 11th, and they made good their escape during the night of October 11th into the 12th. And it was some point during that retreat that the boat was determined to be unsalvageable. It had been badly damaged during the battle, apparently, and they allowed it to sink or caused it to sink into deep water to deny it being captured by the British fleet the next day. And there it rested on the bottom of the lake, for the next 150 plus years until 1997, when it was discovered during a side scan sonar survey of the entirety of Lake Champlain. That was a joint project between the Lake Champlain Maritime Museum and Middlebury College's geology department to map the entire bottom of Lake Champlain. So Rediscovered in 1997, verified by divers shortly thereafter. And since that time, we've been, working pretty regularly to try to determine how best to manage this quite remarkable resource, because the vessel is virtually intact. It's still sitting, upright on the lake bottom in deep water. The mast is still standing. The bow gun is still in place. The two waist guns are the two smaller guns are missing and were, we assume dumped overboard as the boat retreated to try to keep it afloat as long as possible, but otherwise is perfectly intact. So it's really quite an amazing shipwreck to find. And the cold, dark, fresh water of Lake Champlain just provides an extremely excellent preservative environment for wooden shipwrecks. So, and more recently, we've been aiming towards doing some more extensive work on the site in 2026 for the 250th anniversary of all the amazing events that happened in 1776. So in 2021, we carried out an intensive multi-beam sonar survey over the site and its surrounding bottomlands, both to collect new data on the condition of the site, but also to potentially try to locate those missing cannon that were dumped overboard. In 2022, we worked with Kotaro Yamafune, kind of our photogrammetry expert, who worked with us to produce a three-dimensional model of the Spitfire using ROV mounted, or cameras mounted on ROVs, in which we collected about 30,000 still images of the shipwreck that were used to produce a really spectacular photogrammetry model of the site. And right now we're in the process of assembling a research advisory board of other organizations and regional experts and technical experts so that we can devise the research plan and methodologies that we would employ in doing targeted excavation and hull documentation in 2026, or starting in 2026 anyway.
No, you're totally fine. That sounds really cool. So I have a couple of follow-up questions.
Okay.
That I'm gonna throw at you. Do we know why it was named Spitfire?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, because it doesn't actually fit with the other naming conventions that we see with the other vessels. The other gunboats that we have the names for are, the Philadelphia, the Connecticut, the Boston, the Providence, mostly place names. And so Spitfire is definitely kind of an oddball. And I don't have any other further explanation than that. It was not an uncommon name for British vessels. And I assume somebody felt that it would be appropriate to recycle that name for this gunboat. But it is rather an odd choice in this case. But sadly, I don't know much more about that naming convention than that.
Were most of the other ships that were a part of the Battle at Valcour Island or Bay, were they of a similar design to the gunboat Spitfire, or were they more sloop of war or, barkentine? Do we know that information?
Sure. Yeah, the American fleet consisted of these 8 gunboats, and then they had 3 larger rogue galleys, which they built, which were more like 70 feet long and 22 feet wide, carrying 8 to 10 guns. They were lateen rigged, so they had these big triangular sails. The gunboats, in addition to being rowed or having the ability to be rowed, they had 2 square sails, which really made them, being a flat bottom boat, meant they could only sail effectively if the wind was from directly astern, because otherwise they just kind of went sideways and were rowed most often. The rogue galleys, these larger vessels, though, had the triangular lateen rigged sails, which made them slightly better at sailing into the wind. And they had a more traditional hull shape with an actual keel and weren't completely flat bottomed anyway. So slightly better sailing characteristics, though they also had the ability to be rowed, as their name implies. Those were the larger vessels in the American fleet. And then they had a number of smaller sloops and schooners that had been captured previously from the British, or, had been serving as just regular sailing vessels on Lake Champlain that they incorporated into their fleet. So they had a fleet of a total of 15 vessels, but the rogue galleys were the largest purpose-built fighting vessels in the American fleet. And there were only 3 of those.
Did the Spitfire only have the one mast?
It did just have one mast, yes. So it had a mainsail and a topsail, both square. And we have a replica of the Philadelphia, the sister ship to the Spitfire, which is the original of which is down in the Smithsonian. And we've done sail trials with this boat, and it's just a miserable boat to try to sail.
How did that go?
Well, this was actually well before my time here. The boat, our replica, was launched in 1991, and so now, unfortunately, it's aged out to the point where we just have it on display on the hard as a centerpiece on our central lawn. Yeah, it's not a great sailor unless the wind happens to be blowing in exactly the right direction. So it was mostly towed. Well, when we were moving it around, it was mostly towed or rowed, which is not really much fun either. It's about a 29-ton vessel. And you've got 18-foot long ash sweeps to do the rowing with, and it's hard work.
Was it a pretty shallow draft, I imagine?
Yes, extremely shallow draft. Even with all the cannon on board and a crew of 44 men, it probably only drew 18 inches of water, maybe 2 feet of water at the most. So,
oh wow,
very crowded, very shallow. The sides are very low, so there's not a lot of protection for the crew on board. We have some indication that they hung fascines, bundled saplings as kind of additional defensive measures from the sides and give them something to hide behind a little bit. But there, no below decks, no place to get out of the weather, really. Must have been a challenging challenging vessel to live on for weeks at a time for a lot of these guys.
With the burning of the rest of the fleet, because as they escaped and moved south, there were heavy losses taken on both sides. I know. And so when Arnold's ship and some of the other vessels got further enough south, they realized that loss was inevitable. And so they burned the rest of their fleet to keep it out of British hands. Are there any remnants of some of the other vessels that you guys have been able to find?
Absolutely, yeah. So this is where we've also had some very active archaeology in the last few years, is at what's now known as Arnold's Bay, which is actually just a few miles south of the museum here on the Vermont side of the lake. In 1776, that was known as Ferris's Bay, because there was a well-known homesteading family, the Ferris family, that lived right on the shoreline there. And Ferris's Bay is this nice little shallow protected bay, like I said, on the Vermont side of the lake. And Arnold was very, this is one thing that becomes clear as you study Arnold and his operating on the lake, is he was a really clever guy, and he really knew how to read terrain and use it to the best of his advantage. And I think that certainly showed at Valcour and here at Ferris's Bay as well. He knew it was a shallow water bay. He knew that his boats that didn't draw much water could get in there, and he knew that the deeper drafted British vessels couldn't. So when it became apparent that he was going to lose, these 5 vessels, he had the row galley Congress and then 4 of the gunboats that were left with him. And he decided to drive them into Arnold's Bay, has set them on fire, and have the crews jump overboard and escape onto land. And then taking the Ferris family with them, because they were well-known rebel sympathizers, they all traveled overland down to Crown Point and ultimately on to Fort Ticonderoga. So all 5 vessels were burned and abandoned there. The British came back a few days later and actually harvested a bunch of the cannon and other material that they could still see from those burned out hulks, and also apparently found a number of dead bodies there as well, and took them ashore and buried them.
I was going to ask, because knowing how to swim was probably not a pretty prominent skill in that time frame.
Not a common skill. And, from what we can tell, some of these guys were jumping off into probably at least chest deep water.
And in October, it's pretty cold.
The water might not have been too cold, but certainly the air was. They mentioned actually at Valcour that there was already snow on the mountains. So yeah, it wouldn't have been pleasant, that's for sure. Especially after running for 3 days and being chased by the British, probably not sleeping much or eating much,
Shot at a lot.
Yeah, getting shot at a lot. Stressful situations. Unfortunately, over the course of the 19th century, 3 of those gunboats were pulled out of the lake by local farm families or other interested relic hunters. and they're basically just lost to history. In the 1890s, there was a family that operated a ferry, a sail ferry from what then had become known as Arnold's Bay, no longer known as Ferris's Bay.
Sorry, Ferris.
They ran a ferry from there over to Westport, New York. In shallow water or low water events, they could certainly see the remains of the last gunboat and the Rogue Alley Congress there. They tried to recover the Congress, and they ended up just breaking off like this the stern, the last 30 feet of the vessel in the back and dragging it ashore.
Oh no.
Yeah. So we've got a couple of photographs of this, sizable hunk of the shipwreck on shore, which is great. At least we have that documentation. And it's a part of the keel, it's the stern knee and a couple of floors and frames. But unfortunately, that also mostly rotted away. We have two of the floors that have survived and are now in the museum here. So, and then the last gunboat, the fourth gunboat, was pulled out as late as 1952 by the same gentleman who recovered the Philadelphia in 1935 from Valcour Bay, a guy named Lorenzo Hagland. He brought that wreck up in 1952. He moved it over to the mouth of Au River on the New York side of the lake, where he had hoped to open a maritime museum. That unfortunately never came about, and eventually that was also rotted away and was bulldozed. So all that's left of the shipwrecks in Arnold's Bay is the bow, probably about 30 feet of the bow of the Rogue Alley Congress. So since 2021, we've been doing an extensive battlefield survey of the bottomlands of Arnold's Bay itself, the shoreline, and the farm fields surrounding Arnold's Bay to try to get some better clarity on what actually happened that day. And that has also included the excavation of at least a portion of the Congress remains, which we did last year, which is very exciting because while the gunboats are not unknown, since we have the Philadelphia and the Spitfire, and we at least have photographs of this one that was recovered in 1952, we don't really know much about the Rogue Alleys. So I was very excited to have the opportunity to look at some of the structure of the Rogue Alley Congress. So lots of exciting stuff going on in Arnold's Bay, and a place I hope to get back and do some more work in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm looking forward to reading about all that.
Yeah.
I would love to learn more about the Rogue Alleys as well.
But and incorporating the terrain, it's unusual to have a battlefield site that has both on land and in water components. So I think that's been a really fun new experience for us to deal with too. We've done other battlefield surveys that are all in water, and I've worked on other battlefield surveys that are all on land. But this way, we've got components of both and how they overlap and what they can tell us about what happened that day. It's quite interesting. So
I feel like that's a really good way to do total archaeology.
Sure.
In a way that incorporates terrestrial and maritime, because you're also considering the context of the fact that these two are connected. It's not just, two different sites. It's incorporating both, and you need people from both disciplines, as well as that's part of the reason I love Bronze Age so much, is because you have to have the context from the terrestrial archaeology, because there's just not enough left of the maritime.
Sure.
It's fascinating. And so I'm really looking forward to seeing the results of that. Moving back towards the Spitfire, I understand that there is an invasive species of mussel that is threatening the wreck.
Yeah, so we have the unfortunate pleasure of hosting a number of invasive species here in Lake Champlain. And, the shipwrecks in the lake have been pretty severely impacted by the zebra mussel, which came in the early 1990s. Was introduced into the Great Lakes in the late 80s and spread rapidly through the Great Lakes chain, through the St. Lawrence River, into the Hudson River, and finally made it into Lake Champlain in 1993. The zebra mussel is a small mollusk. It's a bivalve. They don't get much bigger than about half an inch, maybe 3/4 of an inch for pretty big ones, but they are prolific colonizers. So, they first appeared in 1993. By 1997, anything less than 100 feet of water is covered in zebra mussels. So, there's the statistic that each adult can lay up to 1 million eggs a year. So once they move into a new environmental niche, it's just an explosive growth pattern, and they tend to pile on top of each other. So you'll get layers of zebra mussels that are several inches thick on these old wooden shipwrecks, which of course causes all kinds of problems for them. But that said, they don't prefer to live much deeper. They even start to fade out about 80 feet. You'll see them down to 100 feet, but not, the colonies tend to thin out. And I think it's just too cold down there for them to prefer that environment.
How deep is the Spitfire?
The Spitfire is deeper than that. It's beyond recreational dive limits, which is
Got
about all I'm willing to say about the depth at this point. But
Nope,
it's
understood. Yep. We don't want to give away the location of the wreck because we don't want to threaten it.
yeah, exactly. What we're really concerned about now is this new, well, it's not new, but a close relative to the zebra mussel. It's called a quagga mussel, which has very similar characteristics to the zebra mussel, but can live to a much greater depth. And they are already found in the Great Lakes. They're already in the Hudson. They're in the St. Lawrence. And, so even the deep water shipwrecks in the Great Lakes are almost all completely covered with quagga mussels as well. And I think in many cases, they actually outcompete the zebra mussels. So we're really concerned. They haven't been found in Lake Champlain yet. We anticipate that happening at any time, unfortunately. Though I have to say that we've been saying that for at least a decade now, and they still haven't showed up. So knock on wood that remains the case. Because then even deep water shipwrecks like the Spitfire would be, literally completely covered with a layer of mussels. Of course, the weight of all those mussels on waterlogged wood is a problem. When they form these thick layers, they tend to create a microenvironment as well, where the water doesn't exchange inside the mussel colony with the outside, and you get bacteria that live in that microenvironment that actually seem to feed on iron. So obviously these boats are all fastened with iron, things like the gun are made out of iron, and they're going to cause even more rapid deterioration of those components of the shipwreck. We have found some zebra mussels on the Spitfire, despite it being in this great depth. And that appears to be caused by shallow water aquatic plants that have zebra mussels on them being dislodged during a high wave or a storm event. And then they form like tumbleweeds that roll across the bottom of the lake, and they've become snagged on the wreck a number of times. And even though the weed mass deteriorates over time, the little zebra mussels relocate from the aquatic plants onto the shipwreck. So I would say there are dozens of zebra mussels on the Spitfire, but they don't seem to be replicating or reproducing. They don't seem to be, colonizing like they do in shallower water.
Almost dormant.
But they are there, and they're kind of the
Yeah.
canary in the coal mine that
Yeah.
if the quagga mussels do show up, they'll be happy to be there, and they'll take over pretty quick. So
Boy. So reading in the news, and you don't have to comment on this if you can't, or, you can pass, absolutely. Reading in the news, there is talk about raising the Spitfire as a conservation effort. Are you able to talk on that at all?
I can talk around it a little bit.
Sure. Yeah. Whatever you are able to talk about, I'm not trying to get anybody in trouble here.
Yeah, sure. Well, so there's a significant effort out there that's aimed towards raising, conserving, and displaying the vessel in its entirety. And that is not a program of research that I'm promoting at this point, but I really see it kind of as a phase 2 to the phase 1 that I'm looking forward to implementing in the near future.
Hey guys, just a quick note coming at you in post. Phase 1, 2, and 3 are phases of an archaeological project. So a phase 1 project could refer to a project in a commercial firm, such as an infrastructure project. For example, let's say a power line wants to put a new track of power line in along this 2,500-mile span. Instead of just going ahead and building things, they'll usually contract out with the biologists first, or the ecologists and the wildlife people to make sure they're not killing any endangered species, and they have to do the ecological survey as well as a cultural survey where they call in the archaeologists. And the archaeologists, as part of a phase 1 project, will go through and they'll dig every determined interval Sometimes it's 50 meters, sometimes it's 25, sometimes it's more, sometimes it's less. It depends on the project and it depends on the terrain. And they will dig certain depths, they'll record the soil, they'll record whether or not they found anything, and depending on the rules set forth by the State Historic Preservation Office, they may or may not collect artifacts, and they may or may not just put them back in the hole, write it down, and move on to the next one. Generally, it's a pretty manual labor-intensive kind of work. However, it's rewarding in its own way, and you learn a lot while you're on the projects. It's great if you're an archaeological technician and you're fresh out of your undergrad and you're waiting to go to grad school. It's a really solid way to get some real experience in the field. However, there's several different kinds of Phase 1 projects, and it's usually just the beginning stages of an archaeological dig, whether or not that's commercial in nature, infrastructural, or academic. A Phase 2 project is much more intensive and often sometimes called intensive survey, or sometimes site examination surveys. It's usually not project-wide, but sometimes it'll target things that were found in Phase 1 and will expand upon those boundaries and delineate where those boundaries end and where they begin. And sometimes you can see more patterns. Like, let's say, for example, in a Phase 1 project, you found something pretty unique, but during the Phase 2, it's not really as unique as you think, and maybe it's just a historic trash pit. And so the archaeology of a Phase 2 project can really help you determine what kind of a site that you have in your hands. A Phase 2 could determine the boundaries for your site that you'll need if you're going to register it with the National Register for Historic Places in the United States. And that's the thing, is most of these rules that I talk about, these are mostly United States centric, especially in relation to federal laws and limitations and, you know, how far you dig, how deep you dig. That's usually based on states and their state rules and their state's Historic Preservation Office, or sometimes referred to as the SHPO. A Phase 3 project is generally what you think of when you think of something like Pompeii. Pompeii is in a very late stage 3, and there are clear borders delineated. There is very obvious signs of habitation. There is very clear significance to the archaeological record, and thus this site is being fully excavated. It's what you see on National Geographic. It's what you see on TV. These are the sexy archaeology projects. These are the big deals that people come in and they really want their name on because they're really important to the archaeological record. They're also just really cool. So there you have it. Phases 1, 2, and 3. Sorry to dry you off. Let's get back in the water.
I believe that all the research questions that I have for the Spitfire can be answered while keeping it in place in its proper context and, excavating and documenting what's there. And that doesn't preclude the possibility of it being raised and conserved in the future. It's an enormous task, to even think about raising that thing, let alone conserving it and putting it on display in perpetuity. So I think there's some additional, studies that need to be done about that, but certainly not an impossibility.
I think some of the estimates that I was seeing for cost is upwards of $50 million.
Yeah.
It can be very expensive to
Very
conserve
expensive.
shipwrecks and timbers and artifacts. Conservation is a pricey business.
Well, and that's I would say that's probably the 10-year cost, right? And then what does it cost to maintain the vessel and the facility basically
Rent.
forever? Once you've brought something like that up to the surface, it's your responsibility to make sure that it's properly cared for and taken care of, forever. Which is what they're finding out with the original Philadelphia in the Smithsonian, which, the boat was raised in the 1930s and it didn't make it into the Smithsonian until 1960s. And now it's undergoing a whole new conservation treatment and reassessment and creation of a new display. So it's, the process never ends when you raise a shipwreck. But it would obviously make an incredible centerpiece for a museum and has enormous research potential. But it's not something that I'm interested in getting that engaged with.
I think there's also a lot to be said for how far you could take the photogrammetry aspect and create 3D models and have those be the exhibits on show. I think there's a lot of room for
Absolutely.
that.
We really see photogrammetry as an amazing way to provide access to shipwrecks to non-divers and divers alike, of course, because it's great for planning your dive. And it's wonderful for archaeological planning as well. If we were to move forward with this idea of doing targeted excavations, I would plan to do photogrammetry, I don't know about a daily basis, but at least a weekly basis so that we could track the progress of the excavation, in stages with a 3D model every time. It's so fast and so efficient. And if it's done right, it's a totally scalable model. So you can actually take measurements, off of the model. They're maybe not as hyper accurate as doing it in person with a tape measure, but if you forgot to take a measurement, when you're down that deep, you don't want to do another dive just to get a couple of measurements. You can probably go and get a good estimate from the model. So 3D modeling is, it's a huge game changer for underwater archaeology. The Spitfire is a great case for that. And this model that we were able to produce in 2022 it's really spectacular.
Is that model available online?
It is. I'll send you a link to it.
That's great. I'll put that in the show notes as well. How has the archaeology shifted with old methods of having to dive the wreck, maybe using an ROV? How has that shifted with the Spitfire and more modern techniques of things like photogrammetry and 3D modeling? And how can that be more of a future for more of the wrecks on Lake Champlain, not just the Spitfire, but extending to some of the other archaeological sites that are within the lake?
So this is where, this is, I guess, one of my concerns with spending that amount of money on, raising and conserving one vessel is that certainly it's at risk of the quagga mussel, but so are all of the shipwrecks on Lake Champlain. So I really would, prefer to have that kind of resources applied to the entire collection of shipwrecks rather than just one. And one of the, I think for a fraction of that amount of money, we could photogrammetry document. I'm not sure how to say that. We could create photogrammetry models of practically every shipwreck in Lake Champlain and make them available, accessible for both researchers and the public to visit and explore. And we certainly, when we create photogrammetry models for scientific purposes, we are trying to make sure that we're creating a scaled geo-referenced model. So its location is precise and its dimensions are actually usable for scientific purposes. It's not just a pretty looking model that you can spin around and look at, which is great, but it actually has some scientific value to it as well. The speed with which you can document a shipwreck using photogrammetry is remarkable. And even if that's your preliminary documentation and then you go back in and refine it with some hands-on techniques, you're greatly reducing the amount of time that you have to spend on the bottom of the lake doing that work, which is, makes it more efficient to go see more sites over time than focusing all your attention on one. And it just allows you to create those models quickly and start providing that access right away, even if you go back and refine them with more work later. So I think a combination of the two is still the best way to go to get the most data possible. Where I find a huge advantage in photogrammetry is recording shapes. Boats are, well, other than the Spitfire, are curvy. These gunboats are flat bottomed and relatively simple hull design, but most shipwrecks have a lot of curves involved. There aren't many straight lines, and documenting those curves is always a challenge to do for archaeologists, where we might use a goniometer to measure angles or do offsets to record a curve where maybe you get 20 points to record a curve. With a photogrammetry model, you're getting literally thousands of points along that curve and much more accurately documenting the shape of the vessel. So those are some of the huge advantages I see to photogrammetry. You can, in a couple of days of diving, you can collect a very detailed, data-rich point cloud that's going to provide a lot more information in a lot less time than you can going down there and taking measurements.
That's the fun part.
I certainly don't want the dive component to go away entirely, because that's the part we all like the most. But But it really, the combination of the two really, I think, provides the best of both worlds. Other technologies that we employ, because sometimes here in Lake Champlain, photogrammetry is not really a great option because the visibility is terrible sometimes, and in certain part of the lakes all the time, part of the lake all the time. So we've also done experiments with mechanical scanning sonar, where you're basically making the same similar point cloud, but you're using a sonar device to do it. You're using sound waves instead of, a visual type of documentation. And that's proven to be very effective as well. A little more challenging because you have to reposition the sensor around the site in just the right way to record the shape, but certainly a viable option for low visibility environments. The massive increase in accuracy of differential GPSs and the resolution of sonar systems, the adoption of multi-beam sonar systems in addition to side scan sonar systems, advances in marine magnetometers. The technology side of things really makes our work a lot easier if you know how to use all that stuff.
Yeah, for sure.
I spend a lot of my time finding people that are experts in those various niches of technology that we can work with, because you can't know them all yourself, or at least be an expert at all of them at the same time. But that's where you get to work with a lot of colleagues that have a lot of experience doing other things. So the high-tech process is here to stay, and it's only making our work more efficient and more accurate, I think, in the long run.
That's what we want.
That's what we want.
As you guys work on the American shipwrecks, the Philadelphia and the Spitfire, there are other British wrecks. I understand that they took heavy losses on their side as well during that battle. Has the British government expressed any kind of interest in these excavations?
No. Well, so there are reports of a couple of the British gunboats, which were smaller than the American gunboats and just had a single gun in the bow. There's report of at least one of them, either the cannon was hit by an American cannonball or it exploded when it was trying to be fired and that boat sank. We've put in a lot of effort trying to locate that vessel and have yet had no luck in finding it. And frankly, from the Revolution, there aren't other British vessels that we've been able to locate or that we understand the fate of. I think most of them were eventually sold into public usage as sailing merchant ships, and God knows what happened to them, unfortunately. Now, we do have a number of British vessels there's at least one from the War of 1812 that's still present at the southern end of Lake Champlain, the Linnet, and then a couple from the French and Indian War, so even earlier vessels from the 1750s that are sunk near Fort Ticonderoga. And we attempted to go work on one of those, the Boscawen, the sloop Boscawen in 2019, and asked for permission from the British government because those sank while they were still considered property of the British government. And they were not interested in us going back to work on that vessel. So even though it had been excavated once in the 1980s, so we worked around it on some other targets nearby. But from that experience, it seems that the Royal Navy is really interested in leaving things as they are and not spending a lot of time doing that. Now, I'm sure that's on a case-by-case basis, but that was the case at that point. There was a huge anchor recovered from the Battle of Plattsburgh site, which is the 1814 battle on Lake Champlain, that we were able to determine came from the British flagship, the Confiance. And it was raised by a couple of local divers up in the Plattsburgh, New York area. We realized what it was, and we actually asked them to put it back in the lake until we had permission from the Royal Navy to recover it. And I think it was brought up in 1999 or 2000. And they did give permission for that to come out and be conserved. And it's now on display in the City Hall in Plattsburgh. But it's a 3,200 pound Admiralty pattern anchor with its cross piece and everything. It's a huge, huge artifact.
Goodness. How did they conserve that? Is it just a big iron anchor, or is it?
So it's a huge iron anchor. It has the wooden stock or cross piece as well. We were able to separate the two and we conserved the cross piece using an alcohol rosin treatment. What we found on the iron portion of the anchor was on the one palm of the anchor, the word Quebec is actually painted on there because it was made in England and then shipped over to Quebec for it to be put onto these vessels. On the other palm is the weight of the anchor painted. So we couldn't use electrolysis or any of our normal iron processes on this huge piece. So it was all mechanically cleaned, which took forever. And then it was, you know, we applied coatings to it to prevent it from rusting again in the future, or and did a brush on coating of polyurethane on the outside to protect it. And so we were able to retain those painted markings as well. Yeah, it's really an impressive anchor. It's 14 feet long, you know, and the crosspiece is also 14 feet. So it's just this massive
That's
structure.
enormous.
Yeah.
Is that because it's proportional to the size of the ship, or the weight?
Yeah, this was the Confiance is the largest sailing ship that ever operated on Lake Champlain. It was, you know, it was a frigate, which for a lake like Lake Champlain is it's a big vessel. I think the anchor would have been even larger though if it was an ocean-going frigate. But this was probably one of its primary anchors that happened to get shot off during the battle. Much like the Battle of Valcour Island, the Americans had tucked themselves behind Cumberland Head, which is just a few miles north of Valcour, and anchored in position, and that caused the British to actually have to sail around Cumberland Head and come into the wind to try to engage the Americans. And the Americans made a special effort to shoot away the anchors off the British vessels, which prevented them from anchoring and then pivoting their boats to bring a new broadside to bear. The Americans had anchors set all over the place, so when one side of the vessel started to get damaged, they could actually pivot the boat and bring a whole new broadside to bear on the British fleet. The anchor also has a couple of dents in it where you can tell it was hit by cannonballs.
That's so cool.
So they were purposefully trying to shoot these anchors off of the bows of the British as they came into the bay. It's crazy.
Sorry, I could talk to you about other shipwrecks on Lake Champlain probably all day long.
Well, we have an amazing collection of shipwrecks, so there's plenty to talk about.
So to pivot back to the Spitfire, though,
yes,
how did you guys verify that it was in fact Colonel Benedict Arnold's gunboat specific, the Spitfire?
Yeah, so this, you know, when it was found, it was still a mystery as to its identification. When it was located with the sonar, we had, because the 4 gunboats that were burned at Arnold's Bay, and as well as this one, they were never really clearly indicated which one was which. And what we did find with the Spitfire is that it actually turns out it had a different armament than the other gunboats, in that it had 6-pound cannon all around. All 3 of its guns were 6-pounders.
Sorry to pull you out of the water again, folks, but I have another message from post-production. After our interview, Chris Sabick actually emailed me almost immediately to send me the links that we talked about in the interview, as well as to send a correction. He said, "I believe I misspoke about the size of the cannon on Spitfire. The bow gun is a 9-pound cannon, not a 6-pound, as I stated when we talked. The majority of the gunboats had a 12-pounder in the bow and 2 9-pound cannon in the waist, meaning around the center of the ship, the bow being the front. Spitfire had 9-pounders in all 3 locations. And now let's get back in the water."
And so by taking a measurement of when we had divers go and verify the site, they were just able to take a measurement of the muzzle of the gun and find out that it was this smaller cannon. And then a few years later, a document was uncovered, which we call the Townsend document, which very clearly outlines what all the American vessels were and what their armament was. And it shows that the Spitfire was armed with 3 6-pound cannon. So those were the key pieces of information that verified that this was the Spitfire and not one of the other gunboats that were unidentified at the time. It was a combination of you know, on-site research and the fact that this really important document appeared at just the right time.
Yeah. How did the Townsend document get uncovered? Was it through archives? Was it like family letters that somebody just had in a box
Yeah,
somewhere?
I
Or
think that's the case. I would have to look back to give you specifics on it, but I believe it was found in a writing desk that was, that's came out of somebody's family storage, and they were getting ready to potentially auction it off, and they found this document inside. Yeah, quite remarkable.
I can't imagine having a 300-year-old desk and then saying, yeah, you know what? I don't want this anymore.
Just suddenly realizing.
Maybe we should search it before we sell it, I guess.
Oh, look at this. Hey, look, here's something. Yeah. Yeah, that's proven to be an enormously valuable document. And, it clearly says, again, what the armament is, but also what happened to most of the boats, burned and abandoned or run up on shore, captured. It's really, and who the captain was.
Just New England things.
Yeah, really important stuff.
That's fantastic. Well, Chris, I think I've had you for almost an hour now. Can you tell everybody where to find you guys online, or if you have any personal social medias that you'd like to share, or any kind of
Sure.
exhibits you'd like to plug? Feel free to do that here.
Yeah. So we're open to the public from mid-May to mid-October, and we are a free admission site. So if you happen to be in the area, there's no reason not to stop by and at least check out what we have going on. We have a whole raft of summer programming this year, which goes well beyond the archaeology side of things. We have boat building and rowing events. We have obviously our displays. We do summer camps for kids in the summer, as well as expeditions where get kids out in boats, traveling the lake and camping along their way for a week or 10 days, giving great expeditionary experiences. We are opening a new exhibit just in the next week or 10 days on canal boats and the canals of Lake Champlain, which is another whole topic that we could spend hours talking about. Yeah. Because that's by far the most common shipwreck we find in Lake Champlain are the canal boats, including sailing canal boats. And so we're really excited to open that new exhibit in a couple of days. And yeah, you can find us online at www.lcmm.org, where you get links to not only what's going on at the museum, but also to the Vermont Historic Dive Preserve System, which we manage on behalf of the state of Vermont, which is a series of now 12 shipwrecks in Lake Champlain that have established moorings so that they're safe for both the divers and the shipwrecks, so people can get out and explore those vessels when they can. And one of those we offer our shipwreck tour to, which we go out on a 40-person passenger boat with an ROV, and we go to one of these dive preserve sites and we send the ROV down, and people can watch the video on a screen on board, which gives non-divers a way to access shipwrecks or the ability to come out and see what a shipwreck looks like, and usually see some cool fish and other fun stuff like that when we're doing those tours as well. So lots going on, and keep an eye on the website for new stuff that's happening all the time.
You'll find the link to that in our show notes as well. Thank you so much for talking to me. I really appreciate it.
I look forward to seeing what you come up with. And I'll be happy to send you that Sketchfab link to the Spitfire model. And of course, if you need any clarifying questions, just drop me a note and I'll get you what information I can.
You heard it here first, folks. Well, actually, probably not first, but you definitely heard it here. So we really thank you for coming to listen. And we, as usual, want to thank our guest. We want to thank Chris Sabick for coming on the show and talking to us today. And we appreciate you, dear listener, for coming back and listening to the Naughty Archaeologist podcast and hanging out with us while we just tell stories. If you'd like, you can follow us on our social medias. I've got Twitter and Instagram at Naughty Podcast, YouTube and TikTok at nautipod, and you can shoot us an email at thenautipod@gmail.com. That's the NAUTI pod@gmail.com. Don't send us anything weird. We know it's an innuendo. So thank you very much. We appreciate you all. And we're looking forward to seeing you guys next week as we talk about the LaBelle with Dr. Jim Bruseth out of Austin, Texas. So we're looking forward to seeing him. He's a delightful individual, and we're really going to have a great episode for you guys next week. LaSalle's expedition went from bad to worse to extra bad to extra worse, and then it sucked really extra super bad. Trust me, you guys won't want to miss next week. So stick with us. We're going to have some really cool guest speakers in the next couple of weeks. And of course, you can always find our sources in the show notes. So thanks again, everybody. Now go get wet, nerds.